Well, you've joined me today at the beautiful Hawcroft Fisheries, and we're here to do something very interesting. It's one of my favourite ways of catching fish during the summertime, and that's margin fishing. But there's a lot more to it than meets the eye, especially on venues such as where we are today at Hawcroft. We're down the margins targeting the wise, clever fish that know when to come and feed, i.e. later on in the afternoon, just when your match is on the verge of finishing or your pleasure session. Those fish know exactly the right time of the day to come down the edge looking for food, because simply that's the time of the day where the majority of anglers are putting bait down the edge, either throwing it away at the end of the session or feeding it down the edge. So it's all about timing with margin fishing. So what I want to do today is run through the whole process: what bait I'm feeding, what hook bait I'm using, what rigs I'm using, how I'm feeding my peg, which is without doubt the most important part of trying to catch margin fish down the edge. A lot of it comes down to stealth. So let's talk about location to start off with. In front of me, to my left, I've got a platform, but I don't want to fish right up to that platform. I want the fish to come to me, and it's all down to feeding. With all aspects of fishing, it comes down to how you feed your peg, how you attract the fish to your hook bait, and that's exactly what we're trying to do and mimic down the edge today when we're margin fishing. Now, down the edge it's about 2 foot deep, and I've got loads of cover. I've got a platform, I've got some reeds, there's loads of foliage there, and a big reason for them fish to hide underneath all the reeds, but I need to drag them out. So one of the most effective ways of catching fish down the margin is ground bait. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about the bait that I'm going to be feeding, then I'm going to talk about the rig and how I'm going to present that float in the water with my hook bait. So there's 2 baits that I really cannot go anywhere without as long as they're allowed, especially ground bait, and that's ground bait and micro pellets. A lot of venues don't allow ground bait nowadays, but if it is allowed, it's absolutely deadly, because yes, it's food content, but it also colours up the water. As we look at the water, even on a coloured commercial like where we are today, the water does look quite coloured, but actually it isn't, it's quite clear. So by adding ground bait down the margin in shallow water, which is generally, you know, down the margins on your local commercial, it could be anything from inches deep to 2, 3, 4 foot down the margins, right against that bank. And what ground bait does, it really does colour that water up and give the fish that confidence to move over that bait very, very quickly. That's why it's an instant reaction from ground bait. However, ground bait is a great attractor, but you need something within that ground bait to hold fish in your swim for a longer period of time. We're talking about big, old, wise fish that have seen it before, and they're going to waft that ground bait about when they come in the peg. So you need some particles within that ground bait to hold for a longer period of time in the area where you're feeding and trying to attract and catch the fish. So that's where micro pellets come into it. Micros are absolutely deadly. They're a little bit heavier, individual particles, but I'm a big believer. I always like to keep my ground bait and my micros separate so I can tailor my feeding patterns according to how the fish are feeding and the depth of the water that I'm in. So what I like to do is I like to add a little bit of ground bait into my pot, a few micros, so there's a reason for the fish to home in on, and then it's all about selection. So hook bait choice, I'm going to be using today bunches of maggots, double worm, double corn, standout baits that really do add contrast to what I'm trying to achieve. You can imagine I'm feeding a dark ground bait, and over the top is 2 big worms or 2 grains of corn, bunches of maggots on a hook that really do stand out and help those carp target my hook bait, which means I'm going to get a bite far quicker. So regarding my bait, what I'm using is Dynamite Green Swim Stim, and well, it's one of my favourite mixers. It's basically a really nice dark fish meal mix, but I've also mixed it in such a way that it's on the verge of what we class as being clumpy, so it's really heavy. Now when you're feeding down the edge, it's really important to mix your ground bait up so it is actually wet and heavy, therefore it's going to get to the bottom far quicker and holding that peg for a little bit longer. And if you notice the colour of it, I always like to get the colour of my ground bait very similar to the colour of the water, which is like a dark green. More like a camouflage ground bait. And that is my go-to ground bait regardless of where I go. I will always take that mix with me. And the most important part is actually adding enough water to it so it's really heavy and claggy. So that is my ground bait. And then my micros, basically what I've done with my micros is I've just soaked them in enough water so they still hold the shape, but they're still individual pellets, and that makes them really heavy and dense, but they're not going to break down into particles, you know, into mush, so to speak. They're just so effective, and especially when your peg's a little bit deeper, micro pellets are absolutely deadly for that reason, for what I've explained. The heavier, they get to the bottom quicker, so for deeper margins, micros are deadly. So let's talk about the rigs, or the rig actually. And this is the beauty about this style of fishing. It's about keeping your fishing simple but logical. So we're targeting big fish down the edge. So I want something with some authority, something that I'm confident in. So let's start off with the elastic for a start. It's through an Aero Pro power kit. These are absolutely brilliant top kits, really, really strong, ideal for what we're targeting today. And they marry with a proper edge elastic. So I'm using an 18 elastic, something with some power behind it. So when I hook these big fish, it gives me a better chance of landing them quicker. And especially in match conditions, you might only get an arrival of fish in the last 10 minutes of the match. If you catch 2 or 3 fish in those 10 minutes, that could possibly add 30, maybe 40 pound or even more to your total weight. So it's really important that you use the right balanced tackle to land the fish quickly and efficiently. Now the rig itself is made up with 021 Aero Slick Silt line. I love this line, it's brilliant for rigs and hook lengths. So friendly with shot as well, so that means you can manage your shotting patterns without damaging your line. Ultra durable, great knot strength, and that's exactly what you need in this kind of environment, this kind of scenario, what we're doing today. Down to an 019 hook length. And if you notice the shotting pattern, I've got a bulk of number 8 right next to my hook length. I've got a 4-inch hook length down to a size 12 Tubertini 175. Nice big hook, which is perfect for the baits I've mentioned. Double worm, double corn, bunches of maggots. That means when I do get a bite, I'm going to hook the fish or give myself a better chance of hooking that fish. Now it's only about, well, I'll tell you exactly how deep it is, and this is the beauty about these top kits. We have markers on these top kits, so it's 18 inches deep. We've got the 2-foot marker there and the float's just below it. So it's about 18 inches deep, which, to be honest with you, at this time of the year, that's the depth you want to look for, or even maybe a little bit shallower. 15, 18 inches is lovely for carp because they feel safe to graze in that depth. And that is the depth I've got within a few inches of the bank side. Also on this rig as well, I've got backshot, and this you'll see when we actually get the rig working. Backshot is so important to stabilise that float, especially when you've got these big fish coming down the margins. It helps securely position that float in place where I've plummeted up, because I've plummeted up so my hook bait is just touching the bottom, which means when a fish sucks in that bait, regardless of what I've got on the hook, it registers on my bristle instantly. And the backshot really do help keep everything in place, especially when you've got maybe 2 or 3 fish coming into your peg and they're wafting the bait about. It has tendencies to move your rig away from the depth where you're fishing, which can often cause like foul hook fish. But with a backshot, 3 number 8 backshot just above the float, really does help stabilize your presentation. So let's do the feeding now. Now I've been feeding it for a while because I've been waiting for the right time of the day for it to work, and you can tell now everything's just starting to work. It's later on in the afternoon, everything's going nice and quiet. The fish are now going to start feeding with confidence. So what I want to do is I want to feed my peg and go straight over the top with my hook bait. Now it's really important this to understand about margin fishing, that it's not something you can feed and just keep fishing. The clever fish, so you have to rest it. You have to feed your peg and give the fish that confidence to come down the margins and feel safe. And this is why I've been feeding it for quite a while before I've decided to fish it. to help give those fish that confidence, because there's no rig in the water. And if you have this problem where you're margin fishing and you're catching a few fish and then all of a sudden it goes a bit funny, just let it rest and let the fish gain confidence again. So to start off with, what I'm going to do is feed 2/3 of a pot of ground bait loose, but like I've said, it's quite wet, it's inert. That means it's going to get to the bottom quite quick, and it's going to create a nice tight focal point in the area where I'm putting my float, with a nice pinch full of micro pellets. No other particles apart from that for now, because I want my hook baits to be selective. I want them to stand out. I want a contrast hook bait. So the one thing I don't want to be doing at this moment in time is adding maggots and sweet corn and other particles within this mix. Once the fish gain confidence, it will work, and then what will happen is they'll wise up to that single bait, and that's where adding, let's say for example I'm fishing bunches of maggots on the hook, all of a sudden they'll wise up to those, just the maggots on their own, and then I'll start adding a pinch full of maggots into my mix just to let them get used to the maggots, or even a couple of worms in the mix to get used to what I'm actually putting on the hook as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to feed the peg now. And of course what I said was, it's all about reaction. I want to feed the peg because the fish come in so quickly. I want to be over the top of that mix reasonably quickly, so when the fish come in, my bait's on the bottom ready to hook that fish. So when your peg is, when you know you're going to be catching a lot of fish down the edge, it's really important to bait up your hook length, your hook bait, your rig, with your hook bait on, so as soon as you feed your peg, you can go straight over the top with your rig. Because literally, when the fish are feeding, they're on this bait within seconds. It's almost as if they're hanging in this area here, waiting for us to feed the peg. So I've fed the peg, and what I'm going to do is, because it's the start of the session, so to speak, I'm going to fish double worm, 2 big baits that are selected for the fish that I'm after. If I was to start off with, let's say, maggots, at the start of the session when there's not that many carp coming down the edge, maggots can often give you false indications from what we call nuisance fish. And at least with a nice big bait such as double worm, double corn, if that float does go, it's either going to be a big bream or a carp, hopefully. There we go. Now, the secret to worms is you need to stun them, because if they're wriggling like that, there's every chance that that worm can double over the point of the hook and mask the hook hold that you may have with a carp that you hook. So you need to stun the worm, and it's quite easy to do. I've hooked them through the nose just so there's plenty of hook showing, and all I'm going to do, I'm going to slap them on the surface, and that stuns them. So a couple of slaps like so, and look at the difference. Look how motionless they are. So that means I've got better presentation with those worms now. Make sure everything's intact. Now the next thing is, always think about stealth. Those fish are very clever. So as I ship my pole out, I'm now going to bring that pole down parallel with the bank. I'm not going to swing it out, because that's the area where the fish are coming into my swim. I'm going to very carefully ship that rig down the bank into my position, get nice and comfortable. I'm going to lay my hook bait there, let the rig drop, and then drag the whole rig to where the bait's gone. See, there's a fish there straight away, and see, it's just spooked. This is how instant it works. So what I'm looking for now is positive indications. I'm looking for a really fast bite from a carp sucking in that bait, or a bream, preferably a carp. And when they're feeding and feeding positively, the bites are very, very positive. And this is why it's really important to have quite a bit of bristle showing, so you can actually read the difference between a false indication and a positive bite. Because what I don't want to be doing is striking at indications that aren't bites. So you can see how that back shot's working now. I'm holding against the float, making sure that float isn't dragging out into the open water away from where I've plummeted up, where I know that my presentation is good. And as I'm talking to you now, I can tell that there's one there. I've already spooked one out of the peg, but there's definitely one there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to be fishing here for about, I reckon, another 2 minutes and talking to you at the same time, and hopefully in that time I might hook a fish. But if I don't, I have to refeed the peg, and this is so important when you're margin fishing. At the right time of the day, you have to force the fish and give the fish a reason to come to your hook bait. And even that fish that I spooked out of the swim could have quite easily spread all the bait I've just fed away from where my hook bait is. So I've always got that in the back of my mind, that if I haven't had a bite within so long, I need to refeed my peg. So you have to be quite positive with your feeding approach when you're margin fishing because of that reason. But once the fish feed properly, you can actually calm down the amount of bait that you feed. It's the actual build up to getting your peg going, which means you have to feed on a more regular basis. And then once they're confident, you can get away feeding less bait. But the fish are so big in here, in this shallow water, they can spread even a big pot full of ground bait and micro pellets over a massive radius. And this is why sometimes you'll feed your peg where my float is, and then all of a sudden you've got tails coming up 2, 3, 4 foot down the bank away from where your float is. And what a lot of people tend to do then is they chase the fish, make the fish come to you. So if I don't get a bite within the next minute now, I'm going to refeed my peg. There's one in my peg, but again, I'm not quite sure whether there's enough bait where my double worm is to actually attract a bite. But one thing I do know is now all my worms are loaded on my hook, I'm going to come back, refeed my peg and put my rig straight over the top, and that is when you generally get a bite off a bigger fish, because they're on that bait instantly, especially at the right time of the day. So let's just see what happens. Give it another 30 seconds. But you can see how still that float is, and that's what you need. You need ultimate bait presentation and stability, because I think anything like movement with these clever fish, you could quite easily spook them. And that's why I'm fishing quite a long length of line as well, having my pole tip higher off away from the float rather than fishing a short length of line with my pole tip waving around right next to where my float is. I'm trying to marry my pole tip with the foliage where my float, there we go. Ooh. Now that's the kind of bite you're looking for. So I've missed that bite. It wasn't a proper bite, because otherwise I'd have hooked it. So now my double worm's on my hook. I'm going to repeat the process. Maybe not quite as much bait, so half a pot, sprinkling the micros, half a pot of ground bait. And let's see what happens now when I've got the opportunity now of going straight over this bait. A kinder pot in this kind of scenario, when you're fishing for these big fish, just isn't enough bait. Now once the fish arrive, in certain scenarios, yes, you can put a kinder pot on and then start feeding small nuggets of ground bait, micros, pellets, whatever you want to feed. But especially here, it's just not enough volume of bait to attract and draw the fish down the edge. Wow, now this is what it's all about. First fish of the day down the edge, and it's so important to make the most of these times when they do feed. And all that feeding, all that perseverance has been worth it, because these are proper weight builders. And I tell you what, it makes it so much more enjoyable knowing that you've fed it and it is going to happen sooner or later. And like what I said earlier, even if it's the last few minutes of the match, you could quite easily catch a couple of fish that will massively increase your overall weight. And with the right setup, you can land them very quickly as well. Biggest fish of the day so far, and what a pleasant surprise that was. What a fish, cracking. So now it's a case of unhooking this baby, as long as it'll let me. It's a wild one. Feed him a peg. Oh, come on son, calm down. the hook out. There we go. Feeding the peg and repeating the process, and hopefully a few more of those will come along. Happy days. This is what it's all about. Well, this is what it's all about. The peg's just getting stronger and stronger. And like I said earlier, without doubt, it is one of the most enjoyable ways of catching fish on commercials. And especially at places like Hawcroft, where we are today, some of these fish are enormous. And this is why it's so important to have the right gear on. They're really hard fighting fish. So you've got to make every one count. Take your time, because these are match winning fish. You spent all that time trying to make it work. You've got to make every fish count. And this is a very unhappy fish. You've just got to be patient and keep that bait going in and get them fish feeding confidently, competing against each other. And that's how you end up getting more bites. And he's not a happy fish, like what I said, and this is why what I've done is I've broken the pole down into quite a few sections, so I have to ship up. I can only have to grab a couple of sections. Really big, powerful fish. Like I said, it's all about persevering. Keep that bait going in, keep feeding, and you end up with a little window where all of a sudden they start feeding. It just popped up at the wrong angle then. Nice big long common. Angry common. It's always the commons that seem to fight the hardest. I got a second chance. And that is what it's all about. Look at that. That is stunning. So quickly hold them up to the camera just to emphasize some of the fish that you're targeting down the edge. Look at that. That's stunning. Absolutely beautiful. And it's just simply a case of repeating the process. Keep that bait going in and the fish will keep coming. Now this is what it's all about, and definitely the peg is just getting better and better. Now the interesting thing is, I start off with worms. Well, like what I said, the problem with maggots at the start, when there's a few more nuisance fish in the peg, you get the wrong bites. But now the fish are there, it's evident to see, even while I'm playing this fish now, they're swirling down the edge. I swapped to maggots, and everything's just working so much better with maggots. Just bunches of maggots on the hook, and in the last 10-15 minutes I've had more weight down the edge than I've had in 4 hours. Proper powerful fish. That one come up and surprised me a little bit, to be honest with you. Really big, hefty fish. And like what I keep saying, it's so important to have the right tackle. And that is what it's all about. And I think we can call that the last fish of the day, because I've absolutely loved it, and I hope you have as well, and taken quite a bit of information from it regarding be positive, keep feeding, and you can end up having a cracking day's fishing on all your commercials at the right time of the day, catching cracking fish like that. Isn't that beautiful? That is what fishing is all about. Let's slip them in the net. Oh, in you go, son. Oh, that was awesome, that. So, until next time, I hope you've enjoyed the session. I hope you've taken a lot away from it. Go and put it to use on your local commercial. But until next time, tight lines.